This happened 5 years ago when I was working as a janitor at a regional hospital in upstate New York. St. Mary's Regional. If you want to look it up, the building dated back to the 1950s. All concrete and linoleum, with that distinct antiseptic smell that never quite goes away. You know the one I'm talking about. That mix of bleach, floor wax, and something else. Something older that soaked into the walls over decades. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and honestly, I didn't mind it at first. The pay was decent, better than my last job, and I'm naturally a night owl anyway. Most nights I was completely alone on the lower levels, which suited me fine. I could work at my own pace, listen to podcasts through one earbud, just zone out and get the work done. The basement was where they kept old medical equipment, broken gurneys, and filing cabinets stuffed with decades of paperwork. It was also where the morgue used to be before they built the new facility back in the late 90s. The old morgue had been converted into storage, but you could still see the heavy door with the temperature gauge, the drainage system in the floor. Everyone avoided going down there if they could help it, but it was part of my route. I had to mop the hallways and empty the trash bins 3 times per shift. Once at midnight, once at 3, and once before I left. For the first few weeks, I told myself the basement was just like any other part of the hospital. Oh, sure. A little creepy, maybe, but nothing to lose sleep over. The fluorescent lights buzz constantly, and sometimes they flicker for no reason. The pipes would clang and groan as the heating system cycled through. Normal building sounds, I kept telling myself. Nothing more. But there was always this feeling down there, like the air was heavier than it should be, like it pressed against your chest when you breathed. And it was cold, not just cool, but genuinely cold, even though the rest of the hospital was always too warm. I'd wear an extra layer when I went down, but it never seemed to help. Around 2 a.m. one Tuesday, I was pushing my cart down the main basement corridor when I heard it. Footsteps, not the sharp click of dress shoes or the squeak of sneakers, but the soft padding of bare feet on tile. They were coming from behind me, keeping pace as I walked. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. My mouth went dry. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 or 6 seconds, listening to hum of the lights and the pounding of my own heart. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the cart wheels echoing weird in the hallway. I started walking again. The footsteps started again. Same rhythm. Same pace. Like someone was matching my stride exactly, staying just far enough behind that I couldn't see them. My hands tightened on the cart handle, and I could feel sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the cold. My heart was hammering as I turned around, shining my flashlight down the empty hallway. Nothing, just flickering fluorescent lights and rows of closed doors stretching back into the shadows. The beam of my flashlight caught dust motes floating in the air, but nothing else. No movement. No person. I told myself it was echoes. That sound traveled strangely down there. The basement was full of connecting corridors and empty rooms. Plenty of places for sound to bounce around. That had to be it. I was psyching myself out over nothing. But when I turned back and continued walking, I heard them again, closer this time. Slap, slap, slap. Bare feet on cold tile, less than 10 feet behind me now. I could even hear the slight squeak of damp skin against the floor, like someone had just stepped out of a shower. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to stop and turn around again. Still nothing. Hello? My voice came out thin and shaky, echoing down the empty corridor. Is someone there? Silence. Just a hum of the lights and the distant clang of pipes somewhere in the building's guts. I was about to turn back when I felt it. A cold spot, like walking past an open freezer door. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath misting in front of my face. And then came the whisper, right next to my ear, so close I felt breath on my neck. Not warm breath, but cold like winter wind. Help me? 2 words. That's all it was. But the voice was desperate, pleading, and so close that whoever was speaking had to be right behind me. Inches away, I could feel the presence there, looming over my shoulder. I didn't look. I didn't turn around. I didn't think. I just ran. I abandoned my cart right there in the middle of the hallway and ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time until I burst through the door into the main hospital. My lungs were burning, my legs shaking, and I had to grab the wall to keep from falling over. The fluorescent lights of the first floor hallway seemed impossibly bright after the dimness of the basement. I made it to the break room and collapsed into one of the plastic chairs, tried to catch my breath, and convince myself I hadn't just experienced what I knew I'd experienced. My supervisor, Linda, found me 20 minutes later, still sitting there, still shaking. "Jesus, Mike, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, then caught herself and grimaced at her choice of words. What happened? When I told her what I'd heard, the footsteps, the whisper, the cold spot, she didn't laugh. She didn't tell me I was imagining things or that I needed more sleep. She just got this look on her face, like she'd heard it all before and had been hoping she wouldn't have to hear it again. She pulled up a chair and sat down across from me, her expression serious. "Listen," she said quietly, glancing at the door to make sure we were alone. "I'm going to tell you something that's not in any of the official paperwork, okay? About 15 years ago, we had a patient escape from the psychiatric ward. His name was Thomas Brennan, 42 years old, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He'd been having a bad episode, getting violent, and they put him in restraints." She paused, rubbing her temples like the memory gave her a headache. "Somehow he got out. We still don't know how. Either he slipped the restraints or someone didn't secure them properly. But he got out and he ran. Security searched the whole hospital, every floor, every room. He just vanished. 3 days later, maintenance found him in the basement. Hypothermia. He'd hidden behind one of the old furnaces, probably trying to stay warm, and just didn't make it." I felt my stomach drop. "Barefoot," I said quietly. "He was barefoot." Linda nodded slowly. They found his slippers in the stairwell. He'd been running, trying to get away from something only he could see. Since then, night staff have reported things. Footsteps in the basement. Whispers. Cold spots. Always around 2 a.m. Always in that same corridor. You're not the first person to come running up those stairs. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Why would you send me down there if you knew? Would you have believed me if I told you before you started? She interrupted. Or would you have thought I was trying to scare you? Look, Mike, I'm sorry, but we need someone to clean that area, and most people don't experience anything. Some people work down there for years and never hear a thing. We were hoping you'd be one of them. I requested a transfer to the day shift the next morning. Linda approved it without question, didn't even ask me to work on a notice period. She just nodded and said she'd have the paperwork ready by the end of the week. I never went back to that basement, and I never planned to, but sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about Thomas Brennan, about him running through those dark corridors, barefoot and terrified, looking for a way out, about him huddling behind that furnace as the cold seeped into his bones, calling out for help that never came. And I wonder if he's still down there, still walking those hallways, still looking for someone who will finally help him find his way home. I used to work overnight security at a radio transmission tower outside Flagstaff, Arizona. The job listing had made it sound simple enough. Sit in a small control booth, monitor the equipment, and make sure nobody vandalized anything. Watch some Netflix, do some reading, collect a paycheck. Easy money, right? The tower itself was about 400 feet tall, red and white striped, with blinking lights that could be seen for miles across the desert. During the day, it was actually kind of beautiful in a stark, industrial way. But at night, those blinking red lights took on a different quality. They'd pulse in the darkness like a heartbeat, casting strange shadows across the scrubland. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and the access road was just dirt and gravel, rutted and washboard from years of neglect. During my shifts, I'd see maybe 1 or 2 vehicles pass by, usually long-haul truckers using the back roads to avoid the way stations on the interstate. Otherwise, it was just me, the desert, and the constant hum of the transmitter. The booth itself was about the size of a garden shed, just big enough for a desk, a chair, a mini fridge, and the equipment I was supposed to monitor. The company had installed it back in the 80s, and nothing had been updated since. Everything was analog, needle gauges, rotary switches, actual physical log books where I was supposed to record the readings every hour. Honestly, I didn't mind the solitude. I'd taken the job specifically because I needed space to think, to process some things that happened in my life. A divorce, a relocation, the usual mid-30s crisis. The desert felt like the right place to reset, you know? No distractions, no demands, just me and the silence. One night in October, about 3 months into the job, something changed. It started with the equipment. The signal meters that usually held steady began fluctuating wildly, needles jumping back and forth like they were possessed. Then the speakers started picking up interference, a low static that rose and felt like breathing. I'd heard interference before, trucks with CB radios, atmospheric conditions, that sort of thing. But this was different. This sounded almost organic. I was logging the malfunction in the book, trying to figure out if I needed to call the on-call technician, when I noticed movement outside. Through the grimy window of the booth, I could see someone standing at the base of the tower, maybe 50 yards away, just standing there, perfectly still, staring up at the blinking lights. At first, I assumed it was someone who'd broken down on the access road, maybe looking for help. It happened occasionally. Tourists would take the back roads thinking they were shortcuts and end up stranded when their sedans couldn't handle the terrain. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside, assuming I'd be calling a tow truck. The October night was cold, that dry desert cold that sucks the heat right out of you. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight as I walked toward the figure. "Hey!" I called out. "You need some help?" No response. The figure didn't move, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge me at all. As I got closer, I could make out more details. It was a woman in a long dress, something that looked old-fashioned, like a nightgown from a period movie. Her hair was hanging loose, down to her waist, and it moved slightly in the breeze. But something about the way she stood was wrong. Too rigid, too still, like a mannequin propped up in the dirt. "Ma'am, this is private property. You can't be here." I kept my voice firm but not aggressive. You never knew what you were dealing with. Could be someone on drugs, someone having a mental health crisis. I'd been trained to de-escalate. She didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. I was about 20 feet away now, close enough to see that her dress was tattered and stained, close enough to notice that her skin had this odd, pale quality in the beam of my flashlight, almost translucent. And that's when I realized something was wrong with her proportions. Her arms hung too long, almost to her knees, like they'd been stretched on a rack. Her neck was elongated, bent at an angle that should have been impossible. And her feet, God, her feet weren't touching the ground. She was hovering there, maybe 3 or 4 inches above the desert floor. I stopped walking. My hand, holding the flashlight, started to shake, making the beam dance across her figure. "What are you?" I heard myself whisper, as if in response. She finally moved. Her head began to rotate, turned to face me with this horrible grinding sound, like rusted hinges or chalk on a blackboard. The movement was too slow and too smooth at the same time, mechanical and fluid all at once. And when her face came into view, I felt my knees go weak. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, wider than any human jaw should go, unhinging like a snake's. Inside was just darkness, no teeth, no tongue, just a void. And that static from the speakers back in the booth grew deafening, even out here in the open air, like it was emanating from her. I backed away slowly, my light still shaking in my hand. Every horror movie I'd ever seen was screaming at me not to turn my back on her, to keep her in sight. As I retreated, she glided forward, not walking but floating, her feet still inches above the ground. That grinding sound continued as her head tracked me, her body remaining perfectly still while her neck twisted like an owl's. I broke and ran. I crashed through the door of the booth and locked it behind me, knowing even as I did that a lock wouldn't stop whatever that thing was. Through the window, I watched her approach, gliding across the desert like she was on rails. She moved through the beam of security light, without casting a shadow. She pressed herself against the glass, and I got a clear look at her face for the first time. Her eyes were completely black, no whites at all, just twin pools of darkness that reflected the red blinking lights from above. Her skin had this waxy, translucent quality, like old candle wax, and I could see dark veined spider webbing underneath. She stayed there for 2 hours. I know because I watched the clock the entire time, willing the minutes to pass, praying for sunrise, just pressed against a window, staring at me with those empty black eyes. The equipment went haywire the entire time, alarms blaring, meters redlining, the speakers shrieking with static. I had to unplug them just to keep from going insane from the noise. Around 5:30, with the first gray light of dawn beginning to wash out the stars, she simply faded away. 1 second she was there, her face pressed against the glass leaving no fog or smudge, and the next she was gone. Just like that, the equipment settled down. The alarm stopped. Everything returned to normal. I sat in that booth until my shift ended at 6. Too scared to go outside, too wired to do anything but stare at where she'd been. When my replacement arrived, a guy named Carlos who worked the day's shift, he took one look at me and asked if I was okay. Just a rough night, I told him, which was possibly the biggest understatement of my life. I quit that job the same day. I didn't even go home first. I drove straight to the main office in Flagstaff and told him I was done. When the manager asked why, I told him everything. I expected him to laugh, to tell me I was crazy, to suggest I get some sleep. But he didn't. He just nodded slowly, like he'd heard all before, and said, "Yeah, we've had some issues at that site. You're the 4th guard this year." 4th. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You knew something was wrong out there, and you didn't warn me? He had the decency to look uncomfortable. We weren't sure what was happening. 3 other guards quit suddenly over the past year, all of them working the night shift. But none of them would tell us why. They'd just turn in their badges and leave. You're the first one who's actually told us what you saw. And you're still sending people out there? Alone. He didn't have an answer for that. Just processed my termination and handed me my last paycheck. As I was leaving, he called after me. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I should have told you. I never found out what that thing was or why it appeared at that tower. But sometimes when I'm driving at night and I see transmission towers in the distance, their red lights blinking in the darkness, I wonder how many of them have something waiting beneath them, something that watches and waits for someone to be alone. I worked as an attendant at a downtown parking garage in Seattle for about 2 years. Pike Street Garage, if you know the area. It was a massive structure, 8 levels above ground and 3 below. During the day, it was packed with commuters, business people rushing to meetings, tourists looking for summer park while they visited the market. But at night, especially after midnight when the bars closed and the late night crowd went home, it was a ghost town. My job was to patrol each level every hour, check for stragglers, make sure all the gates were functioning and nobody was sleeping in their cars or doing anything illegal. It was usually boring work, just walking around empty concrete floors with the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls and low ceilings. I'd listen to podcasts, practice my Spanish with language apps, anything to pass the time. The pay was decent, and I liked the autonomy. Nobody looking over my shoulder, no customers to deal with unless someone had a problem with the payment kiosks. Most nights, I'd see maybe a dozen cars come and go between midnight and 6 a.m., and half of those were Uber drivers using our lot as a staging area. The third sublevel was always the worst. It was the oldest part of the structure, built in the 1960s when they first excavated under the building. The newer levels above and the first 2 sublevels have been renovated over the years. Better lighting, fresh paint, security cameras everywhere. But sublevel 3 was scheduled for renovation that kept getting pushed back due to budget issues. So it remained in its original state. It had this oppressive feel to it that I could never quite shake. The lights were dimmer. Those old yellowish bulbs instead of the bright LEDs they'd installed everywhere else. The ceiling was lower, maybe 7 feet instead of 9 or 10 in the newer sections, which gave you this feeling of being compressed, pressed down. And there was always this smell, like mildew and decay, despite the ventilation system that supposedly ran 24/7. The smell was the worst part, honestly. It got into your clothes, your hair. I started keeping a change of clothes in my locker because I couldn't stand going home smelling like that. My girlfriend at the time complained about it. Said it was like I'd been swimming in swamp water. Around 3 a.m. one Saturday, I was doing my rounds on sublevel 3 when I noticed a car I'd never seen before. An old sedan, probably from the 1980s, parked in the far corner near the maintenance access door. It was a Mercury Grand Marquis, the kind of boat-sized car that you rarely saw anymore, painted in that particular shade of tan that every car seemed to come in during that era. The weird thing was I'd checked this level less than an hour earlier during my 2 a.m. rounds, and it definitely wasn't there. I would have noticed. That section was usually empty. People avoided it because it was the furthest from the elevators and stairs. I walked over to investigate, planning to check if it had a valid permit displayed. We had problems with people sneaking in through the street entrance and parking without paying, and part of my job was to tag and report those vehicles. As I got closer, my flashlight beam playing across the dusty paint, I noticed the windows were fogged up from the inside, like someone had been breathing in there. Heavy condensation, the glass practically opaque. I knocked on the driver's window. Hello? Security. If someone's in there, you need to show me your parking permit. No response. The fog on the windows remained undisturbed. I tried the door handle, expecting it to be locked, but it clicked open easily. When I pulled the door open, cold air rushed out, much colder than the rest of the garage. It was like opening a refrigerator. That immediate temperature drop that made me step back. My breath came out in visible puffs. Even though it was June and the garage was usually warm and humid, the interior was empty except for a child's toy on the passenger seat. A small stuffed rabbit, worn and dirty, its fur matted and stained. One of its button eyes was missing, and the other hung by a thread. It sat there propped against the seat back like someone had carefully placed it. I reached out to pick it up, thinking maybe I could use it to identify the owner, and that's when I heard the giggling. It was coming from somewhere behind me, echoing through the concrete structure. The sound of a little girl laughing, that high-pitched, innocent sound that shouldn't be terrifying, but somehow was in that moment. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the level, but it was empty. Just rows of support pillars, empty parking spaces, and shadows. The giggling continued, seeming to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the concrete and creating this disorienting echo effect where I couldn't tell which direction it originated from. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This isn't funny. Come out where I can see you." The giggling stopped abruptly, cut off mid-laugh like someone had pressed a mute button. The silence that followed was somehow worse, thick and heavy and expectant. I could hear my own breathing, too fast, too shallow. Could hear the distant hum of the ventilation system and the tick of the old car's engine cooling. I backed away from the car, keeping my flashlight moving, scanning for any sign of movement. I headed for the elevator, walking backward for the first few steps because I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me. As I walked, I heard small footsteps running, those light pitter-patter sounds of child's feet on concrete. They were behind me, keeping pace, getting closer. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there, just empty space and shadows and those endless support pillars marching back into the darkness. But I could hear them clearly, running footsteps that would stop when I stopped and start when I started, playing a game I didn't understand the rules to. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I reached the elevator. I jabbed the button repeatedly, watching the floor indicator light up as the car descended. 3, 4, 5. Why was it so slow? The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear breathing now, fast and excited like a child playing tag. The doors finally opened with a ding that seemed too cheerful for the situation, and I stumbled inside, hitting the ground floor button over and over even though I only needed to hit it once. As the doors began to close with that hydraulic hiss, I saw her, a little girl in a white dress, standing in the exact spot where the car had been. But the car was gone now. It had vanished as completely as it had appeared. She was just standing there in that empty parking space, holding that stuffed rabbit, the same one that had been on the passenger seat. Her face was hidden in shadow, turned down toward the rabbit like she was examining it. Then, slowly, she raised her head to look at me. The shadows fell away, and I saw her face clearly in the fluorescent light. Her skin was gray, the color of concrete, and her eyes were just dark hollows, empty sockets that seemed to go back forever. Her mouth was open in a small O of surprise, or maybe she was still laughing silently. The elevator doors closed, cutting off my view. I stood there shaking, my back pressed against the wall, as the car lurched upward. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I practically fell out, gasping for air like I'd been holding my breath. I didn't go back to sublevel 3. Not that night, not ever. I called my supervisor, Dave, and told him the lights were out down there, that it wasn't safe for me to patrol. He grumbled about it, but said he'd send maintenance in the morning. Just cover the other levels for tonight, he said. For the rest of my time at that garage, I had the other guards cover that level. There were 4 of us who rotated shifts, and I swapped whenever sublevel 3 came up on my route. Some of them gave me shit about it, called me lazy, said I was making them do my work. I didn't care. I wasn't going back down there. When I finally quit about 6 months later, I mentioned the incident to Dave. I was leaving anyway, so I figured I might as well tell him the truth about why I'd been avoiding that level. I expected him to laugh it off, but he didn't. He got quiet, looked down at his desk, and then said, "You saw her too, huh?" "Too?" He nodded slowly. We've had reports over the years. Not often, maybe once or twice per year, but enough that it's a thing. A girl in a white dress, usually on sublevel 3. Sometimes people see the car. Sometimes just her. Sometimes just a toy. What happened? I asked, not sure I want to know the answer. Dave pulled up something on his computer. Scrolled through what looked like old incident reports. 1987, he said, finally, a family was parked on sublevel 3. The mother went to pay at the kiosk. Told the daughter to stay in the car. When she came back, the girl was gone. They searched the whole garage, called the police, did everything. Found her 3 days later. Where? He looked at me, his expression grim. In the trunk of an abandoned car on sublevel 3. A old Mercury. Someone had grabbed her, put her in there, just left her. She'd suffocated. They never caught who did it. I felt sick. The same car I saw. "We don't have that car anymore," Dave said. It was removed as evidence back in '87, but people still see it sometimes. Same make, same model, same spot. And they see her too, still looking for her mother, still trying to find her way out. I left that job and tried not to think about it. But it stays with you, something like that. Sometimes when I'm in parking garages now, any parking garage, doesn't matter where, I avoid the lower levels. I take the stairs instead of the elevator. And I never, ever park in the back corners, because you never know what might be waiting there in the shadows, still playing, still searching, still alone. I spent 4 years working night maintenance at an automotive parts factory in Detroit, American Axle Manufacturing, one of the old plants that somehow survived when so many others shut down and moved production overseas. The plant was huge, nearly 1 million square feet of floor space, with assembly lines that stretched the length of football fields, stamping machines the size of houses, and rows of industrial equipment that never fully shut down, humming and clicking even when no one was working them. During the day shift, the place employed over 800 people. It was loud and busy and chaotic, with forklifts zipping around, workers clustered at their stations, supervisors yelling over the roar of the machinery. But during the night shift, only a skeleton crew remained. Maybe a dozen machine operators keeping the essential equipment running, 1 floor supervisor, and me. My job was to troubleshoot equipment failures, perform routine maintenance, and respond to any mechanical issues that came up. I like night maintenance. You gotta work independently, make your own schedule, solve problems without someone breathing down your neck every 5 minutes. The pay was decent too. Union wages with night differential. And there was something almost meditative about working in that huge space with just the ambient noise of machinery for company. The plant was divided into sections based on when they'd been built. Sections A and B were the newest, built in the 2000s with all the modern equipment. Computer-controlled assembly lines, robotic arms, all that high-tech stuff. Section C, though, was different. It dated back to the 1940s. Original construction from when the plant was first built during the war boom. The equipment in Section C was ancient by industrial standards. Everything was manual, heavy mechanical systems with huge gears and flywheels and drive shafts. The kind of machinery that could tear your arm off if you weren't careful. The kind that required lockout-tagout procedures and two-person teams just to do basic maintenance. It was scheduled for renovation, supposedly, but that had been planned for years and nothing ever happened. Budget issues, they said. Corporate priorities. I had to check Section C twice per shift, making sure nothing was leaking or overheating, looking for fire hazards or safety violations. The section was mostly idle, the equipment powered down and silent, waiting for a renovation that might never come. It was eerie walking through there, seeing all that massive machinery sitting dormant like sleeping giants. One night in February, around 1 a.m., I was doing my rounds in Section C when I heard the machines start up, all of them, simultaneously. The sound was incredible, overwhelming. The conveyor belts lurched into motion with a screech of metal on metal. The stamping presses began their rhythmic pounding, massive hammers dropping with impacts you could feel through the floor. The overhead cranes groaned to life, their motors whining as they move along their tracks. And underlying it all was this deep, throbbing hum of power, like a heartbeat as the main drive shaft began to turn. I ran to the control panel, thinking maybe someone had accidentally activated something. Maybe there was a malfunction, but the panel was off, powered down completely, all the breakers in the off position, the main disconnect open. There was no power flowing to this section. It was impossible. Yet the machines kept running, getting faster and faster. The noise was deafening, metal shrieking against metal, bells clanging, pneumatic systems hissing, alarms blaring. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was physical, pressing against me like a wave. Then I saw them, workers, at least a dozen of them, maybe more, moving between the machines, performing tasks with practiced efficiency. They were dressed in old-fashioned work clothes, coveralls and heavy canvas shirts, cloth caps and leather aprons, the kind of clothing you'd see in photographs from the 1940s. And they were completely oblivious to me. I stood there frozen, watching them work. They loaded parts onto conveyor belts. They checked gauges and adjusted settings. They moved with the synchronized choreography of people who'd done these exact motions thousands of times before. Their faces were smudged with grease and sweat, expressions focused and intense. "Hey!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the machine noise. "Stop. This equipment isn't supposed to be running." They couldn't hear me. Or maybe they just couldn't hear me at all. They continued working, paying me no attention whatsoever, like I didn't exist in their reality. As I watched, one of them, a young guy, couldn't have been more than 20, reached toward a running stamping press. He was guiding a piece of metal into position, one hand on the workpiece, the other reaching for the control lever. I knew what was going to happen a split second before it did. "No!" I screamed, running toward him. "Don't!" His arm went into machine, pulled by the inexorable force of the descending press. I screamed a warning, but it was too late. The massive hammer dropped with its terrible pounding rhythm, and his arm was caught between metal plates designed to crush steel. But there was no blood, no scream, no crunch of bone or tearing of flesh. He just disappeared, dissolving like smoke, his body fading into translucence, and then nothing, scattered by an invisible wind. And one by one, the others began to fade as well, growing transparent and insubstantial, their forms wavering like heat mirages. Within seconds, they were gone. All of them. The machines wound down, their sound gradually diminishing. The conveyor belt slowed and stopped. The stamping presses completed their cycles and fell silent. The overhead cranes came to rest. And suddenly I was alone in the silent factory, standing in the middle of Section C, surrounded by equipment that shouldn't have been running in the first place. I stood there for I don't know how long, trying to process what I had just seen. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing so fast, I thought I might pass out. The silence was almost as overwhelming as the noise had been, broken only by the tick and ping of hot metal cooling. Finally, I went back to the control panel and checked it again. Still off, still no power. I looked at the machines themselves, ran my hands over the drive shafts and gears. They were hot, genuinely hot, like they'd been running at full capacity. Some of them were even steaming slightly, condensation forming on the cold metal. I reported the incident to my supervisor, a guy named Rick who'd been at the plant for 30 years. He listened to my story without interrupting, his expression getting more grim as I went on. When I finished, he just nodded slowly and said, "Section C, huh? Yeah, that section's got a history." "What kind of history?" He pulled out his phone and did a quick search, then showed me an old article from the Detroit Free Press, dated August 17, 1943. The headline read, "12 Dead in Factory Accident." I read the article with growing horror. A hydraulic failure had caused a catastrophic malfunction in the main power distribution system. Multiple machines had activated simultaneously, and the safety systems had failed. 12 workers had been caught in the machinery, crushed by stamping presses, torn apart by drive belts, mangled by gears. The article described it as one of the worst industrial accidents in Detroit history. They were working a double shift, Rick said quietly, taking his phone back. War production. The plant was running 24/7 making parts for military vehicles. Management was pushing for higher output, cutting corners on maintenance and safety checks. When the system failed, those guys didn't have a chance. "And you're telling me this has happened before? Other people have seen them?" Rick nodded. "Not often, maybe once or twice a year. Someone working night shift in Section C reports seeing workers or hearing machinery that shouldn't be running. Most people don't say anything because they think they'll sound crazy. But it's in the incident reports if you know where to look. Been happening since the 40s. Why do they keep running that section then? Why not just tear it down if it's haunted?" He gave me a look that was half pity, half resignation. "Because that would cost money, and this is a union shop. You can't just close a section without negotiations, environmental assessments, relocation plans for the equipment. It's easier to just leave it sitting there until they can afford to do the renovation properly. Plus, most nights nothing happens. You just got unlucky." Unlucky, that was one way to put it. After that night, I refused to enter Section C alone. Company policy said all maintenance work in idle sections had to be done solo to save on labor costs. But I told Rick flat out that I wasn't following that policy anymore. He could write me up if he wanted, fire me if he had to, but I wasn't going back there by myself. To his credit, he didn't fight me on it. He just adjusted the schedule so that whenever I needed to check Section C, I'd wait until one of the machine operators was on break and have them come with me. Most of them thought I was being paranoid, but a few, the older guys who'd been there for decades, understood. They'd seen things too, or heard stories from people who had. One of them, a guy named Earl who was close to retirement, told me about a night back in the 90s when he'd been working overtime in Section B and heard the machine start up in Section C. He'd gone to investigate and found all the equipment running at full speed, just like I had, but he hadn't seen any workers. He just heard voices, shouting, screaming, the sound of panic and pain. He'd run back to the break room and refused to go near that section for the rest of his career. Some places hold on to their past. Earl told me, his weathered face serious. Especially places where people died badly. It's like the trauma gets soaked into the walls, the floor, the machines themselves. And every now and then, under the right conditions, it plays back, like a recording. Do you believe that? I asked that it's just a recording, that they're not really there. He shrugged. I don't know what to believe, but I know what I heard that night, and I know what you saw, whether they're ghosts or echoes or something else entirely. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is that you respect it. Don't go looking for it. Don't try to provoke it. And for God's sake, don't go in there alone. I followed his advice for the rest of my time at that plant. And even with someone else there, Section C always made my skin crawl. The air felt wrong in there, heavier somehow, charged with the kind of static energy that made your teeth ache. The temperature was always a few degrees colder than the rest of the plant. Cold enough that you could see your breath in winter. And sometimes when the plant was quiet and you listened carefully, you could hear sounds coming from Section C. Faint and distant, like they were coming through water or from very far away, but unmistakable. The rhythmic pounding of the stamping presses, the whine of the conveyor belts, the clang of metal on metal. And underneath it all, if you really listened, you could hear voices, men talking, calling out to each other, coordinating their work. I left that job 2 years ago when I got an offer to work at a newer facility on the other side of the city. Better pay, better hours, and most importantly, no Section C. But I still think about those men sometimes, those 12 workers who died doing their jobs, trying to support their families during wartime. I think about them trapped in that section, forever working, forever repeating the last moments of their lives. Some deaths don't stay quiet. Some tragedies echo through time, playing out again and again in the places where they happened. And some machinery, once it's tasted blood, never really stops running. It just waits in the darkness, patient and hungry, for the next time someone walks through alone. I heard a few months ago that the company finally approved the renovation of Section C. They're tearing out all the old equipment, replacing it with modern systems, completely gutting the place. Part of me hopes that we'll put those men to rest, that destroying the machines will break whatever cycle they're trapped in. But another part of me, the part that stood there watching them work, watching them die, knows better. Some things can't be renovated away. Some places remember, no matter what you do to them. And some nights, even in the newest, most modern sections of that plant, the workers still hear the old machines running in the darkness, still hear the voices of men who died 75 years ago, still working their shift, still trying to meet their quota, because some debts can never be paid and some shifts never end.